Suzanne and Spring, who will be helping me with the presentation today. For today's agenda, we will go over the overview of HCD, missions and role, fair housing obligations, current trend and existing condition, and finally, outreach and engagement. Let's begin on the next slide. HCD have to provide stable, safe, home affordable to veteran, senior, young family, farm worker, tribes, people with disability, and individual and family experiencing homelessness. Our vision is every California resident can live, work, and play in a healthy community of opportunity. In the next two slides, I will be talking about what we do here at HCD. We increase the supply of affordable places to live in California by administering programs that provide grants and loans. We create rental and home ownership opportunity for Californians, including veterans, seniors, young families, people with disability, farm workers, tribes, and individual and family who are experiencing homelessness. We preserve affordable homes and protect public investment through asset management and compliance. We monitor affordable developments that use HCD funding to ensure they remain affordable for between 35 and 55 years and complying with program requirements. How do we protect mobile home and manufactured home owners? Similar to the way California DMV manages tiling and registration for automobiles, we manage the tiling and registration for mobile homes. We also protect family and individual who live in mobile home by inspecting mobile home alterations and mobile home parks to ensure they are properly maintained and by enforcing regulation for those who build and sell manufactured home. Next slide. How do we guard health and safety for all Californians through building standard and code adoptions? We implement standards for housing construction and maintenance and train local government inspector who inspect for health and safety code violations. We create specialized standards for Cal Green and universal design, which ensure housing is accessible to all, including seniors and people with disabilities. How do we ensure California plans for a range of housing that meets various needs for California? Housing is one of the most important parts of the community, and the way we plan for housing had wide-reaching impact on the environment, education, health, and the economy. We play a critical role in the housing planning process, which was designed to ensure that community plan for housing that meet the needs for everyone in California communities. We work with each California region to determine their housing needs and review each city or county's housing plan, also known as housing element, to determine whether their housing plan comply with state law. Finally, how do we create effective solution to the housing crisis through policy and research? We at HCD develop policy that support housing and community development and conduct research and analysis of California housing markets and needs. We produce California statewide housing plan, California consolidated plan, and other special reports. On the next slide, I would like to talk about accountability and enforcement. Since our last fair housing report, multiple state housing laws regarding housing production, homelessness, housing element, and housing accountability and enforcement, to name a few, have been passed by the state legislature. While all those laws will not be covered in today's presentation, they will be covered in our final report. Yeah. However, we would like to briefly mention that one of the biggest state laws changes we experienced as part of the 2021-2022 state budgets was the creation of the Housing Accountability Unit within HPD Accountability and Enforcement Branch. Finally, while education and technical assistance is always the first step in our accountability efforts, The Housing and Accountability Unit hold jurisdiction accountable for meeting their housing element commitment and complying with state housing laws. Violation of these laws may lead to consequences in rectification of housing element, certification, or referral to the California Office of the Attorney General. Now, I would like to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Spring. She will be covering fair housing obligations.
Thank you, Douglas. Good afternoon. My name is Spring Packard. My pronouns are she, her. I am a fair housing policy specialist in HCD's Fair Housing Unit. I have been with HCD since 2016 in various roles. If you have a visual impairment or it's difficult to see me, I am a white female in her mid-40s with brown shoulder length hair, rose gold glasses, and I have a black turtleneck on today. For today's presentation, I will be discussing HCD's fair housing obligations. So HCD receives funding for housing and community development from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, known as HUD. This funding is received in the form of various HUD programs that include the Community Development Block Grant Program, Emergency Solutions Grants Program, Home Investment Partnership or HOME Program, Home American Rescue Plan Program, National Housing Trust Fund, and Disaster Recovery and Mitigation. All HUD funding programs are required to meet the 1968 Fair Housing Act's requirement to affirmatively further fair housing. Specifically, affirmatively further fair housing means taking meaningful actions when taken together, address disparities in housing needs and in access to opportunity, replacing segregated living patterns with truly integrated and balanced living patterns, transforming racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity, and fostering and maintaining compliance with civil rights and fair housing laws. The duty to affirmatively further fair housing extends to all HUD's program participants' activities and programs relating to housing and urban development. Next slide. So the Fair Housing Plan plus the AFFH duty. This fair housing planning process occurs every 5 years in conjunction with the development of HCD's Consolidated Plan, also referred to as CON Plan. HCD is obligated to affirmatively further fair housing. Completing a fair housing assessment is part of that AFFH duty. This planning process also requires engagement with stakeholders, advocates, and the public. And the Fair Housing Plan must discuss and identify barriers to fair housing choice and issues impacting persons with protected characteristics. Next slide. Okay, protected characteristics, federal. The 1968 Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination when they are renting or buying a home, getting a mortgage, seeking housing assistance, or engaging in any other housing-related activities. The following are the federal protected characteristics. I'm going to go through them all, but I'll just give examples of a few. And they are as follows: race, color. This would be, for example, treating people differently based on their skin tone. Religion. This includes religious dress and grooming practices. National origin, sex, familial status, which includes the presence of children under the age of 18, adoption, pregnancy, or adding any kids in any other manner, and disability, which includes mental, developmental, and physical disabilities, including HIV, AIDS, cancer, and genetic characteristics. Next slide. So protected characteristics for California. California state law protects individuals from housing and employment discrimination and harassment on the basis of federal and state protected characteristics. Protected characteristics under state law include the federal plus the following. Again, I'm going to list them all, but I'm only going to give examples of a few. And the California protected characteristics are citizenship. For example, this is treating people different based on their citizenship or residency status, sex or sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, gender, genetic information, marital status, military or veteran status, medical condition, ancestry, source of income. Now this, which means lawful, verifiable income paid directly to a tenant or representative for a tenant, including the use of governmental rental assistance such as Section 8 or Housing Choice Voucher. Housing providers may inquire about a tenant's income and source of income, but they may not discriminate against the tenant because housing assistance is a source of their income. Immigration status is also one, as well as primary language, and age. And now I will hand it over to my colleague, Suzanne, who will be discussing the current trends and existing conditions.
Hey everyone, good afternoon. My name is Suzanne Hemphill. I'm a Fair Housing Policy Data Specialist too in HCD's Fair Housing Unit. I've worked on statewide housing programs in various roles since 2010. For those who might be looking away from the screen, I'll just describe myself briefly. I am a Caucasian woman. I have long brown hair. It's up in a ponytail, and I'm wearing a white sweater today. And I have a HCD Teams background on. So we at HCD, we envision a future where every Californian has a safe, stable, and affordable home. I wanted to share a brief quote here from Governor Newsom. The California dream, the idea that every person can achieve a better life regardless of where they start out, is central to who we are as Californians. Too many Californians are experiencing the squeeze of stagnant wages and the rising price of building block necessities such as housing, healthcare, education, and childcare. We can and must reanimate the California dream, building a California for all. So when we talk about building a California for all, we're also going to talk about the current trends and existing conditions and California's housing problem. So our housing crisis is a half century in the making. Decades of underproduction, underscored by exclusionary policies, have left housing supply far behind need and cost soaring. As a result, millions of Californians who are disproportionately lower income and people of color must make hard decisions about paying for housing at the expense of food, healthcare, childcare, and transportation. 1 in 3 households in California doesn't earn enough money to meet their basic needs. And today, so I'm just going to pause for a second and explain cost burden. So housing is considered affordable when a household pays less than a third of their income on all housing costs. If you're paying more than 30%, you're considered cost burden, and therefore your housing is unaffordable. California's inadequate and vulnerable supply of affordable housing disproportionately impacts our most vulnerable communities, and that we're talking about Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So when we talk about California's housing crisis, we also want to think about, what folks on the ground are seeing and how they're feeling about this. Nearly 6 in 10 Californians think the state should require local governments to build their fair share of new housing that is affordable for the workforce in the region. Renters overwhelmingly support the requirement to build affordable housing and do not think localities should determine the kinds of housing built. And also on this slide, you'll notice that San Francisco and Los Angeles, some of the most expensive parts of the state, folks there are more accepting of wanting the state to require localities to build their fair share of affordable housing. So the next slide, we're going to talk a lot about race today, knowing that race is central to equity and a really important part of our work, and that a rising tide lifts all boats. So when we talk about race, we're also talking about some of the intersectional identities that folks have, whether it be disability, or if you have children in your household, or you're a senior trying to age in place, all of those things. So poverty rates vary dramatically within and across racial and ethnic groups. So nearly a third of all Californians live in poverty. And this chart, orange is poverty, and the gray box is near poverty. So, if you're near poverty, you're pretty gosh darn close, and we want to count those folks too. So overall, a third of Californians are in or living near poverty. During the pandemic, there were some declines in the poverty rate with expansions to the safety net, But those expansions have mostly expired by the end of 2020. And while economic growth countered some of those programs' losses, the state's overall poverty rate increased from 11.7 in fall of 2021 to 13.2 today. And the rates are really different across different racial and ethnic groups. So annual housing production, just a note here, housing production varies. There are peaks and valleys. We're going to get to that in our next chart. Historically, California has built close to 211,000 units a year. A more recent trend is building 92,000, and this is part of California's housing problem. Median home values have gone up significantly, 36% from 2011 to 2022. This chart gets at housing production in California. The light blue, those are single-family homes. The orange are multifamily homes, so structures with 2 or more units. And historically, California has built a lot more units. Since 2008, we've been building about 92,000 a year. There are peaks and valleys, and we're hoping to increase production in California that will help affordability. So we want to talk about extremely low-income renters. These are the folks with the least in our state, and who these folks are and what they look like. So we're talking about 1.3 million households, or 22% of the state's population. The majority of these folks are in the labor force. They're working low-wage jobs. So that's about 37% of folks. The next largest category are seniors, followed by people who are disabled. Other 4% are in school getting some additional education, advancement, and training, and 2% are single adult caregivers. California is short about 1 million units for extremely low-income households, and the units that are available in California, the 2-bedroom rental home, HUD's fair market rents show that you need to have an income of almost $88,000 a year to afford it. So there's a big mismatch between these groups. We also want to take a moment to talk about cost burden by race and ethnicity. Renters of color face the highest cost burden in California. You can notice on this chart that white households have the lowest severe cost burden. That's this 25% right here. The catastrophic impacts of COVID-19 have only exacerbated housing supply and affordability crisis and highlighted the historical disadvantages for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. For example, 2/3 of Black households are cost burden. You'll see that here, the 63%, compared to under half of white households. So when we talk about affordability in California, we need to also talk about race and differences. So we're going to pivot and talk about fair housing complaints. These are complaints that were filed with our partners at the California Civil Rights Department, and they can be filed on a bunch of different protected characteristics or bases, like the things that my colleague Spring mentioned. So the headline in California and across the country is that disability complaints overwhelm all of the other categories. Researchers believe this is because often people with disabilities need different treatment or asking for exceptions or different policies to be able to have equal access to housing programs. So they might know when they're being discriminated against. Now, the second largest category was race, 172. And then source of income, that's how you pay your rent or if you have a voucher or some kind of subsidy. And that was recently protected in California. So seeing that as a complaint is an interesting trend. It sounds like the law changed, but there's still more that needs to be done to help increase education and outreach and enforcement, so folks actually comply with the great laws we have. Next slide, we also want to talk about immigration. California is home to immigrant communities from over 60 different countries. The promise of economic opportunity has long attracted people from all over the US and the world to California, resulting in one of the most racially and ethnically diverse states in the nation. However, disparate incomes persist across these groups, which we'll see. The chart on the right-hand side of the screen compares California with the nation as a whole. And California has a smaller percentage of white residents, a somewhat smaller share of Black residents, and a much larger percentage of Latinos and Asian Pacific Islanders. 27% of Californians are foreign-born, and 46% of California children have at least one immigrant parent. And this is really important to know when we're planning for our state and our communities. Again, touching on disparities, it's a key measure of well-being, and it varies by racial groups. So annual income, the percentage of folks that own a home, and college graduates, there are disparities across all of these categories, unfortunately. And incomes, just like you could dig in even deeper to this, that incomes are significantly higher among Asian Pacific Islander households and white Californians than among Latinos, African Americans, and Native Americans. And it's similar rates for college completion and home ownership. But these numbers also mask considerable variances. For example, within Asian and Pacific Islander communities, Asian Indians have by far the highest incomes of $170,000, while the Hmong population has lowest incomes at $74,000. And there are differences even among Latino populations between folks born in the US or folks born outside of the US. And those differences also show up with Black or and also Native American populations. Native Americans that are Native in combination with another race tend to have higher incomes compared to those who identify as Native American alone. So we also want to talk about homelessness. California has the largest amount of unhoused people in the country, unfortunately, 181,000 folks, but not in the chart on the left gets at sheltered and unsheltered. Almost 58,000 of those folks are actually sheltered, sleeping inside, and 123,000 are unsheltered, sleeping outside. This represents a quarter of all the people experiencing homelessness in the United States. And this within that number includes 26,000 people that are families with children, 9,600 unaccompanied youth, and 10,000 veterans. And that this has increased significantly from 2013 and also from 2020. The number of people experiencing homelessness, it doesn't mirror the state's general population. Black or African American people in California are overrepresented in homelessness, representing about 5% of the state's population, but 28% of those accessing homelessness services. The share of Black or African American people experiencing homelessness, as well as American Indian, Alaskan Native, or Indigenous people experiencing homelessness, is 5 times greater than the respective share of the state's overall population. So as we talk about equity and outcomes, we want to think about how our systems serve folks and how they have different outcomes. Again, just a couple other statistics. Age is another interesting variable when we talk about unhoused folks. There's a large percentage of people under 18. This could be due to LGBTQIA issues and not feeling safe or accepted within their family of origin. 28% of folks unhoused reported having experienced domestic violence. So again, there's a lot of intersectional overlap in people's lives. 47% reported disabling conditions, and 7% identified as veterans. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague Spring to discuss the project timeline, outreach, and engagement.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Suzanne. As Suzanne said, I will be discussing the timeline and outreach and engagement for the Fair Housing Plan. Next slide. So first, I'm going to provide a high-level timeline of the project, and then on the slides following, I'll go into a bit more details. So today is the kickoff of the Fair Housing Plan. Beginning on July 31st through March 20th, we will be conducting 6 topic specific listening sessions, and then follow that with 2 webinars. We will also be conducting a community needs survey, which will be available for 2 months which will be available for a 2-month period. And then we will be conducting a 30-day public comment period on the draft Fair Housing Plan. 3 public hearings will be held during that period as well. And then finally, we will publish the Fair Housing Plan on August 30th, 2024. Next slide. So to get into a little bit more of the details, we will be conducting the listening sessions. Like I said, on January 31st, we're going to be kicking it off with homelessness. Second is going to be disability and aging population, and that will be February 7th. Immigration is going to be February 14th. We'll be holding a tribal listening session on the 21st of February. Tenant protections will be held on February 28th, and mobile home parks on March 5th. Next slide. We will also be conducting some larger specific public webinars. And the first one will be on urban areas. Just for some background, we know that that fair housing issues in urban and rural areas can be similar, but they can be different. And more importantly, the solutions generally can be a little different. And so that's why we're splitting it up. And so like I said, we are going to have a webinar on urban areas. And then we will have a rural webinar on March 20th. And then, as I stated before, we are going to have 3 public hearings. They will be between July 28th through August 13th. We don't have the exact dates yet. We're still trying to narrow that down and figure that out. But we are going to be holding one in Sacramento, and then one in Southern California, and one in Northern California. Next slide. Awesome. And then the community needs survey. There will be an online survey that addresses issues and barriers related to fair housing choice. We will be making the survey available in 6 languages: English, Spanish, Chinese, Korean, Tagalog, and Vietnamese. And again, it'll be available from January 30th till April 1st. It's slightly over 2 months to accommodate some holidays. And then, just so everybody knows, all of these outreach and engagement events will be advertised via eBlast. In about a week, they'll all be on HCD's website, and we'll also announce them via social media, as well as announcing them during our public meetings. And with that, I'm going to kick it back to Suzanne to do our discussions. Thank you.
Okay, y'all, we've shared a bunch of background information and we really want to hear from you. So we're going to transition into a discussion section and breakout rooms. So just quick setting the table of community standards. It's always helpful to be curious. You can raise your Zoom hand and ask questions and provide feedback. We're going to put you in breakout rooms and you'll have a moderator from HCD that will walk you through these questions. It's helpful to use I statements and talk from first person situation. Nothing to argue about. We want to respect everyone's experience and be mindful of different styles of communication and learning when speaking. Some folks are fast processors. Some folks take more time. So some people might be ready to go and some folks might really be digesting information. There's room for all of those differences. We're here to help explore and develop fair housing impediments. We really want to know what's getting in the way of you living where you want to and having an affordable home, and how we can make California great. Our door is open. If you want to provide questions and feedback, you can reach out at that email address. As Spring mentioned, we've got a lot of outreach coming up, so this doesn't have to be the only time that we engage with each other. So these are the questions. These are the questions we came up with, but we're really here to talk. Hear directly from folks. You might be speaking of clients you serve or people you work with in that capacity. It might be about your family's experience, but we really want to find out, how have you found housing? What are the barriers to accessing housing? What are the issues most pressing for you, your family, your community, the people you serve, and the state of California? What's working well in housing in California? What's not working well? And what's not captured by the data that we showed you? So it's just about 1:30 now, and I'm going to go ahead and put folks in breakout rooms. You should be assigned a moderator from HCD, and I'm guessing there'll be about 50 folks in a room, just doing some quick math. And I'm going to give you 20 minutes to talk about this. There are no wrong answers. And then I'm hopeful each breakout room can come up with like a point person, and we can share out together and maybe like popcorn and see what great ideas come up. So I'll give folks 20 minutes, and I'm going to zoom you into your breakout rooms.
You crushed it, Susie. Good job.
All right, so for those of you with me in the main room, we can discuss these questions as well. I can also throw you into other breakout rooms, but I'd kind of love to hear what's going on in your community and what you're seeing. All right, folks in this room, if anyone wants to come off of mute and chat with me about any barriers you've experienced in accessing housing, I'd love to hear from you.
Hi, can you hear me? I don't
I
think you.
sure can.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
I'm
yes.
sorry. I'm just having the hardest time coming off mute. I can share something about barriers to housing. My husband was a paraplegic. And so it was when we were buying a home, of course, we fully understood that we would have to remodel it to get help. I mean, to be able to have him go inside the house. And we were very, very fortunate that we had family in the construction business. But if we did not, it is such an incredibly expensive thing when you're buying a used home
Yeah.
to remodel, or when you're renting. Now we came to find out that when you're renting, if it's an apartment complex, and I don't know about how many units they have to remodel it for you to be accessible, like for you to get in to by the doors. But that's not truly the full accessible thing, because then, there's the bathrooms and all that. So I think that that's one of the things for people, the expense of having, outside of everything else that you have problems with, sometimes not wanting people, renting to you. It's the expense of accommodating, of making it barrier free for you.
Yeah.
It's so we all, and I'm a person of color too. So we always think that's one of our, and of course it is, but there's a lot of other barriers to to just accessing housing.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're naming financial,
Mm-hmm.
and that there might be reasons why somebody would want to rent, but also just like home renovations for
Right.
paraplegic. Yeah.
Yes.
I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yep. Yep.
Other folks have things you can share, barriers? Soledad, if you want to talk more, I'm happy to dig into that more. I'm kind of curious what it was like buying a house, thinking of that. I'll just share personally. I have lived with someone who was in a power wheelchair. So when you said that, I'm like, yeah, let's absolutely talk about this. Disability is a human experience there for all of us. And like, I want all those bodies to be housed.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting because it's sort of second nature to me now. Like, you go in and you just want to make sure that so before I knew him, I was just like, oh, the door jams, or whatever they're called, the doorways have to be wider. But it's not just about that.
Yeah.
It's about, possibly the light fixtures being lower on the wall. It's about the cabinets being lowered so you can reach them. It's about being able, if you cook, not having a stove, but a stovetop so you can roll underneath it. Same thing with the sinks. It's about depending on where you're at, like you can't, like most kitchens have the dishwasher right next to the sink, which makes total sense if you're able-bodied. But if you're not, you have to have a cabinet between that, because that's where the wheelchair, because you're sideways in. The wheelchair takes a lot of space. So it's all those little things that if you're not able-bodied, they don't come to mind automatically. And like, I think we understand disabilities, but most people, like I found with him, he is able to do so much. He, and lived alone for a lot of years. But people think that if you're disabled, you can't do anything, but that's not necessarily the case. You just accommodate your living space.
Yeah. And I appreciate you raising that up, that people might not expect that. And it's totally possible. And I love hearing that somebody was living independently on their own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Did you think about location or proximity to like transportation okay, what kinds of
Absolutely. So one of the things, we lived out in the country, and that was kind of hard because everything is dirt. So it was difficult for him. But when we moved into the city, it was great because everything's flat and there's curb cuts. And then even places where we travel, we had to be very aware of where we were going to travel because could we get help? Could we, the US is great. We have the federal act. There's a lot of laws and there's a lot of transportation is accessible here. You can get on a bus and they have the lifts, but not everywhere you go. So like some cities are wonderful, completely embrace Washington DC is one because everybody go, or Chicago completely embrace that. But like if you go to New York City, which is an older city, the streets are very narrow and there's no curbs and the buildings are very tall and narrow and mostly straight. So I mean, you have to think about things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can see rural areas maybe not having the infrastructure, but I wouldn't necessarily think of New York City as also being tricky, maybe because it's an older city and doesn't have like the accommodations built in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else want to come off mute? Talk about your housing struggles or wins or what is not working?
Then I have a question.
Yeah.
What is HCD position regarding reasonable well, mostly modifications that are structurally or financially not able to be completed to, sometimes the building is not structured to, let's say, put a walk-in shower.
I see.
So what's the, especially at the HCD funded properties?
Okay. Yeah, so there's a whole arena, and we can talk about this a little bit now, but I'm also happy to give you my contact information and maybe we can circle back. But it sounds like you're talking about a situation where a development receives funds from HCD to build affordable housing, and it's a unit in there and someone needs a walk-in shower. Is that right?
Or, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we should probably circle back and I'll figure out how to give you my contact information. What I would say at a very high level is it depends on the funding source and it depends on the responsibility that comes with that. And there are scenarios where things cannot be modified, but I guess like I would be looking to see, did that housing provider, did the developer, did the sponsor, did the owner say, is there something else we can do, right? Because sometimes it is this walk-in shower that must be this way, and sometimes there's something else, like a wand, it gets into the specifics of what someone needs, but the goal is to keep folks housed and to find something that works, so it should be an interactive process. And I'd say like if that unit actually could not be modified and there are specific kind of tests or analysis that people go through on that of cost and load bearing walls and those kinds of things, that it might be possible to move someone to a different unit in the portfolio.
Yeah, we do look at other options, including in some cases we do offer, those transferable shower chairs that they can sit on and they just slide over to under to be able to use that tub and still sitting down so that they don't, because sometimes we do come to situations where, some of the older buildings are not so structurally be able to convert into a walk-in shower.
Yeah, and are you asking about, like, are you someone that houses people? Is this for a family member? Do you work for this company? And we don't have to talk about the specifics either.
No, I work with affordable housing, so.
Cool. Yeah. I just sent you my email address and phone number, but we can get into the specifics. You know, I think everybody wants to keep folks housed and in their homes. And there are some laws and programs that make that more or less possible. But even if like you work for a housing provider and housing providers need more information on how this works, like we're really here to listen and get feedback. And so if that's something that would be helpful, I can try to lift that up internally as well.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, other folks, you're in the giant waiting room with me. We're talking about these questions, but really whatever comes up for you about housing. If you're able to access it, if you want to know where it is, if something works well, if it's a total nightmare.
Can you hear me?
I
Am I
sure
on mute?
can. Yes.
Oh, okay, great. In my community, the effort to build more about affordable housing are being resisted by people that are interested in maintaining parking. They don't want to give up available parking or be inconvenienced in their parking for the sake of low-income housing. And that's the current battle. And it feels to me like so much resources are wasted on having these fights before anything can be done. You know, well, I'm sort of an idealist, so me, I'd rather see all that energy and all the money funneled into, you know, something very productive rather than you know, suing to stop or trying, like one group is trying to put it on the ballot for November that, you know, just say, no, you're not allowed to build housing here. We want to keep the parking lot. Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. And if you want to say more about where you live, that could be helpful or not. I think what I'm hearing is that there are real fights over what we're going to use our land for.
Yeah.
And parking
So I
charges.
live in Eureka, California, which is in Humboldt County on the northern coast, and it's a small community. I wouldn't say, well, the city probably has maybe 30,000 people, but the county as a whole has about 130,000. So it's considered a rural county. But
Yeah.
Eureka is like a real city. It's just a small real city, if that makes sense. But anyway, yeah, so the city is trying to increase its affordable housing stock, and just there's enough hurdles as it is to develop housing, period. And then when you have people in the community opposing it and organizing to oppose it, it just makes, those are other barriers, right, just to making housing available.
Yeah.
Political.
Yeah. Okay, we've hit 20 minutes. I think I'm going to give folks about another 5 minutes. So we'll be in this room. If anyone else wants to come off of mute and talk about what's happening in your community.
Are any of the other people in this room having the same experience in their communities that I was talking about?
I'll just share that HCD has, well, actually the legislature has given HCD more authority on this, not necessarily specific to parking, but just more authority on like making locals have a specific development process and follow it. I think because of some of local opposition and just barriers to housing development. So I think bringing that up like that seems to be on point for the state of California, and also sometimes like a moving object of like this part of the development process gets bottlenecked and then maybe it moves somewhere else. So maybe parking is a part of that.
it's really, they don't keep the records enough so that you can go get quick referrals.
Hey, y'all, we're coming back to the main room.
Yeah, we are here. Thank you, Suzanne.
Okay, wonderful. So this is just kind of a report out. We had 5 rooms. Does anyone from room 5 want to kind of share some of their highlights or insights or what came up for folks?
Hey, Susie, this is Nicole Mendoza with DRC, pronouns she, her. I can share out. We had a great room. We had suggestions like for people who are new developers of affordable housing and are trying really hard to create affordable housing, but are getting roadblocks, you know, what can they do to overcome those roadblocks and get that affordable housing built, and like what can HCD do to help people who want to build affordable housing. I think another suggestion was like webinars and meetings, things like that, specifically on that. And then we talked about like there's a housing crisis and people like the majority of the population like rallying the troops for that isn't necessarily the issue. It's more getting the politicians who are in charge of removing these barriers to move. And so like how do we do that? We talked about the housing element as a tool at the local level, but we also talked about, you know, what can the state do and the federal government do and HCD. We had a really great discussion and some examples of things that do work, like San Diego's density bonus program in creating more affordable housing. So it was a really great group. Thanks.
That's super helpful. And I love thinking of what HCD's role could be specifically and how we build more housing and house more folks. Room 4, is there somebody that wants to kind of share out some feedback, what came up for folks?
That wasn't, I don't remember which room I was in, Suzanne. Was I 4 or 2?
I don't remember either.
You can share.
All right.
What came up? This is great.
I'm sorry. It showed up for a blip for a second when I entered the room. But it was a great discussion. We had folks from Leadership Council, DRC, city folks. And one thing that was really, I think, resonant across the board that Gino lifted up was around access and information to get access to affordable housing. So basically, like, what are the processes? How does someone seeking housing actually get into the process of obtaining affordable housing? That the systems seem secretive or at the very least opaque, and it seems impossible for folks who are seeking affordable housing to get to it. So we really need to increase transparency, and then also lift it up that, you know, as the economy gets worse, more and more people will be seeking affordable housing, and there'll probably be people at different resource levels, and that could exacerbate inequities and folks' access to affordable housing. And then also the folks from DRC lifted up that for folks who are, you know, people with disabilities, it gets really difficult as, you know, some of the like coordinated entry system folks would, you know, the folks explain to them the resources and the different accessible features they're going to need in order to be successful in their living space. And when the coordinated entry staff have difficulty finding that, sometimes they put some pressure on those residents to take less and to accept housing that doesn't meet their needs. And so that was another issue that was brought up. The issue of senior housing and the need for that. Also, student housing. We had a person from the city of Arcata who was talking about the growing senior population they have, but also some they're college towns. They need student housing and sort of how that's treated in RENA and in the housing element is a concern. Cities made the point that most cities make, which is that cities don't build affordable housing for the most part. And so, being able to direct people to resources is really important. So that whole issue of like, how do you get people into housing? How do we make the system less opaque? Was a consistent theme. And then from a rural perspective, we talked a little bit about access and being able to have meaningful input into public processes such as the housing element. Leaning on things like access to the internet and like website information just isn't real viable for some of those communities. Also, a lot of monolingual speakers. So just being really thoughtful about how you engage in folks. Another issue that came up from our friends who are sort of in the nonprofit sector and the advocacy sector is that, going to talk to them about the community issues just isn't enough. You don't want to check a box by talking to one of these groups. You want to make sure that you're reaching out to specific communities or community people, communities, and then maybe even grassroots organizations that are dialed in. And then on the alternatives to a web-based engagement, you could obviously going to meet people where they are is ideal, but there are always barriers to that. But so you could use mail, you could use community hubs like schools and other community hubs. EJ issues, making sure that we're thinking about environmental justice issues as we think about housing siting was an issue that got lifted up, making sure those are safe and healthy places to live. Just make sure. And then we definitely that whole issue of box checking by talking to nonprofits was something that came up, I think, over and over again. But I think I covered it all.
Thank you. Real quickly, I was in the main room. Some folks stayed behind. Could have also been technical issues, but we talked about local resistance or barriers to permitting and getting housing built. In particular, I think it was in Eureka where there's maybe a preference for parking over housing. And then we also talked about someone shared that someone that they live with is paraplegic and just home renovations and how perhaps rental housing and affordable rental housing that has a subsidy includes more accessibility features, and how like a kitchen for an able-bodied person and a kitchen for someone who has some disabilities might be different. You might not want the dishwasher next to the refrigerator for pulling things out, and differences in rural, urban, but even that like someplace like New York City might not have all the curb cuts, perhaps because it's an older city, but newer infrastructure like post 1990 might be easier. Is there someone from room 3 that could share?
I again don't know what room we were in, but do you want me to just go ahead and share?
Yeah. Yep, that sounds good.
Okay. So you guys have actually touched on a lot of what we discussed. I maybe would say some of what was discussed that wasn't brought up was the difficulty of HCD emphasizing opportunity zones and when there's a need for preservation and also to bring services to some of the other communities. So to possibly expand that to include areas that need to be preserved, older neighborhoods, etc. And then let's see, sorry, my notes are moving around here. Yes, okay, we talked about opportunity zones. Another one that we talked about, there was a lot of issues with just landlords and landlords not, how do I say this? Landlords that are essentially not acting in good faith in many ways, pitting tenants against each other was one example. A lot of different things just going on. We had both people from Oakland and San Francisco discuss just the different like even one talked about how you could go in and like they were literally said, well, if you can pay more than the other person, I'll let you have it. So a lot of just things like that occurring. And so how do you educate landlords on the laws? And that brought us to, we actually had somebody in our group that is a resident who is seeking housing and struggling and being denied basically because of her credit check and Section 8 voucher. And so we discussed a little bit about that in the new SB 225, which basically gives voucher holders the opportunity to provide other evidence of how they can pay. I believe that just passed the first of this year. And then it was brought up the fact that there's so many new laws that landlords don't really even know what those new laws are. And a lot of the affordable housing and service providers in the communities are struggling to get landlords to understand that they cannot do many of the things they're doing. And so it was recommended that maybe like a pamphlet from the state or something that kind of outlines these laws and says what they are would be a helpful way to help communities kind of pass that message along. So that was one. And then let me see. Another person to talk about as a homeless provider, just that the systems recently don't seem to be kept up as well. And so when they finally get to the point to be able to actually, get somebody into housing that's currently unhoused, that the information and the data is not up to date. So there's a lot of kind of I don't know if spinning the wheels is correct, but there's a lot of searching and trying to figure out who's the right people to access right now for this housing. So those were some things we discussed. Douglas, did I miss anything?
No, I think you cover everything. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That resonates. I think a lot of laws have been passed and changed, and it makes sense that maybe it takes additional education and outreach for folks to really get those rights. But those are absolutely good points. Anyone from group one?
I could speak since I was the moderator. I was looking all to notes. So I think our group had a really good discussion, and thank you for everyone for typing in the chat and speaking out. I would be going through all of it. So for the first one, I would like to say that a lot of people feel that they've been priced out. A lot of people feel like they can't really stay in their communities that they grew up in, or their children, or where their friends may be. And a lot of this has been due because of recession cuts, or really because they don't have like a family member who could have handed them down like an affordable house or like an affordable apartment, things like that. Another thing was that there was this great mismatch between like 2010s or 15s to now, where essentially the price of like rent has skyrocketed, but like the wages haven't really skyrocketed the same. So as people are slowly like getting increases or like moving up in jobs, like the feel for that crisis is still the same. So there's really no benefit, but like there's still that struggle, even though there's technically you're moving up financially. It doesn't really feel that way. And another thing is that that was noted that a lot of these rural or cities outside of a main impacted city are then absorbing the shock or the rental markets of the other cities. So that was one thing that was noted there. I think another thing was that like there's just been like really strict access to housing to even get an apartment, like credit checks, or really having something be 3.5 times your income to even rent an apartment, meaning that you would have to either make 100K or 200K, to even get considered to, get that apartment for you, things like that. And then it's really looking at, how can we look at data a little bit differently? How can we highlight these, disparities? And really thinking about how can we be less reliant on the private market and really use state finances for state homes, or like kind of like more affordable homes. And then also just really creating like these safety net barriers for people with disability, or really people with special populations who, maybe because of a healthcare crisis or something, they might have been out of a job for X amount of months, and yet there's no safety net. And to get unemployment or your benefits, it's a long process. So within that year, you didn't get paid, you could have become homeless. And really thinking about those issues like that, I think those are those really things. And then also just thinking about our financial market differently, just thinking about how could we, increase funding or money. I think that was really the main focal point of our discussion. But thank you for everyone for discussing and putting your thoughts and opinions out there. Really appreciate.
Super helpful, Ashley, and thank you for jumping into a moderator role. Y'all mentioned so many things, including just like intergenerational wealth and passing on homes or rentals. Like these are really important issues. Yeah, Spring, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, there's some comments in the chat. Did you want me to read those, or did you want to?
Oh, let's go to the last room. I think there's one more room that hasn't shared out, and I don't know what room it is. It might be room 3.
Hi, this is Jennifer. I was part of room 2, and our biggest topic of conversation was affordability. And thank you to Judd for really capturing what the issue was within our group was housing affordability. That said, we did identify in terms of fair housing, how people found housing, which was word of mouth, coordinated entry, websites, including online search engines, and then the City of San Francisco's portal, Dahlia. We weren't able to capture barriers to housing, but for the person that started to explain their story, please feel free to send those barrier comments to HCD. In terms of the most pressing issue, it was really 2 things: housing affordability, which I mentioned. We can't afford to buy, we can't afford to change our rental situation. And then the second was entities that are against affordable housing developments and applications, and really seeing those groups or people that are against development will ultimately result in a worse housing situation down the road. Success includes the Dream for All funds, which were used to get people into their first homes. Thank you. And maybe the things that aren't working well were we can't meet the unmet demand. The higher income households are starting to move out of California, and so we're losing that potential property tax capture there. Perhaps people aren't taught financial skills early enough in life to understand loans, credits, and then be able to access housing opportunities that are offered to them. And then we have a long list of items that may not be captured in the data, and that's increasing rents, how the programs really ensure truly affordable housing, lack of financing that's available for housing construction, and more specifically, affordable housing construction. The difficulty of obtaining construction materials, and that ebbs and flows, the change in rules for financing affordable housing, the loss of redevelopment dollars, HUD pulling out of financing affordable housing, the change in regulatory restrictions to build housing, being that definitely in the past, there were a lot more restrictions, and we're starting to see them change a little bit now, but people are still experiencing those restrictions. The data may also not capture overcrowding, short-term rentals, the housing market related to the wage market, credit and how that affects someone's ability to obtain housing, and also the appraisal standards, being that appraisals in neighborhoods of color or underprivileged neighborhoods may have lower appraisals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Y'all were really, really thoughtful and detailed. Those were 4 rooms. Is there one remaining?
Nicole kind of kicked us off, just speaking for room 5 a little bit, but again, just kind of highlighting some of those points about, the different barriers you face when trying to work with local entities, the barriers that newer developers might face. And again, how to highlight kind of policies that have worked well in certain places and how to make those things that other places can be, other places in the state can implement.
Thanks, Zach. I'm just going through the chat box. We're winding down for today. There was a really thoughtful question about how folks can report civil rights violations from planning department officials. It depends on the specifics. You can reach out to us at the email address. I'm gonna maybe go to the next slide if I can. Doing all the things with all the screens. This is how you sign up for our emails. www.hcd.ca.gov. But this is also the team working on this fair housing plan. This is our email address. And so if you have a concern and want to figure out how to move forward with it, I would just make a note about local planning department officials. HCD might have some authority. Every public entity with housing and community development responsibilities in California has to affirmatively further fair housing. Proving that and going through litigation is kind of a long and winding path, but there are new tools and enforcement things available. But Spring, maybe we should just run through some of these questions or even just vocalize it. I really appreciate everything folks are offering up today. And Alexander said, without a method to ensure or enforce regulations are followed, there will continue to be barriers that are insurmountable. And it sounds like folks today have really vocalized, credit checks, 2.5 times the rent and income, that these can all be like really, really, really significant barriers for folks. Everything that's put in the chat we'll also be taking back and kind of analyzing as a team, and using all of this feedback hopefully to come up with a robust fair housing plan for California for the next 5 years. So if you've put it in the chat, we've received it, but you're also welcome to reach out to us again. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today and taking the time out of your busy schedules. We're going to have ongoing outreach and engagement activities, and we'll keep sending out additional information. Tyrone, I saw you come on camera. Is there something you want to add to this and help close us out?
Sure. I was just coming on to thank everyone. Really appreciate the discussion. I know these are large meetings and difficult to have, but I feel like everyone really brought themselves forward and participated. So thank you so much for that. This is really helpful for us in our process, and for the team and myself to be able to hear this feedback. So just want to thank everyone for their participation, and please reach out if you have any further questions or any other information you want to provide for us. And thank you to the team. You did a great job. So with that, I think we can give folks the rest of their day. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.